Over the centuries, studies of the life of Jesus have raised numerous questions. But one of the most fascinating and debated is, what language did Jesus speak? Was it Greek, commonly spoken in the region due to Hellenistic influence? Aramaic, the everyday language in Israel? Or Hebrew, the language of the scriptures and Jewish religious traditions? In this documentary, we will explore the historical, cultural, and biblical evidence that sheds light on this question. From the language of the synagogues to the words recorded in the Gospels, we will analyze how the language of Jesus reveals the scope of his message and his connection with the different communities of his time. Before we continue, tell us, which language do you think Jesus spoke? Aramaic, Greek, or Hebrew? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Let's get started. The question of what language Jesus spoke has been debated for centuries. The historical and cultural context of first-century Israel, a region marked by the influence of various empires and traditions, it presents us with a complex and multilingual linguistic scene. Throughout this journey, we will explore the three languages most likely spoken by Jesus: Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. We will analyze each of these languages in its historical, cultural, and religious context, based on the work of scholars, historians, theologians, and linguists. Through this analysis, we not only seek to discover what language Jesus spoke, but also to understand how Jesus' use of language influenced and continues to influence the interpretation of his teachings and the lasting legacy he left on humanity. To better understand the context of Jesus' time, it is necessary to go back to the land of Israel in the first century, a period in which the region was under the control of the Roman Empire. Although Israel was part of the vast empire, the Jews of the region maintained a deeply rooted cultural and religious identity that influenced their daily lives. This environment created a complex society, characterized by the interaction of diverse traditions, beliefs, and languages. In this context, the linguistic landscape of Palestine was remarkably diverse. Three main languages coexisted in the region, each with a well-defined role in different aspects of social and religious life. Aramaic was the language spoken by most of the inhabitants of the region, including Jesus and his followers. It was a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and was used in daily communication, both in homes and in markets, and in interactions between different communities. Hebrew, on the other hand, although not as common in daily conversation, had an important function in the religious sphere. It was the language of sacred scriptures, such as the Torah and the prophets, and was used in synagogues and religious ceremonies. During this period, many Jews continued to recite prayers and read scriptures in Hebrew, even though not all of them fully understood the language. Finally, Greek was the language of Roman administration and commerce, and its influence was considerable, especially in the larger and more cosmopolitan cities of Israel, such as Jerusalem and Caesarea. It was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, which meant that it was used in communication between people of different origins and regions. Furthermore, many of the New Testament writings, including the Gospels, were written in Greek, as it was the most accessible language to a wider audience in the empire. The coexistence of these three languages not only reflected the diversity of Palestine at that time, but also influenced the way in which the Jews of the region lived their faith, related to the Roman power, and communicated with each other. This linguistic plurality is key to understanding many of the events and teachings related to the life of Jesus, who moved in a world where linguistic and cultural boundaries were fluid and dynamic. The key question that arises when studying the linguistic landscape of Palestine in the first century is, how did Aramaic and Greek become dominant languages in the region? To understand this question, we must first analyze how Aramaic became such an influential language in Israel. Aramaic, a Semitic language originating in Mesopotamia, began to spread rapidly throughout the Middle East beginning in the 7th century before Christ, especially with the rise of the Assyrian Empire. Its influence grew further when the Assyrians and later the Babylonians occupied large parts of the region. During the expansion of the empire, Aramaic became established as a lingua franca in many of the areas that the Assyrians dominated, due to its simplicity and flexibility. The influence of Aramaic was further consolidated when the Babylonians, who succeeded the Assyrians in the region, took control of Judea and other parts of the Levant. The crucial moment for the adoption of Aramaic by the Jews was the Babylonian exile in 586 before Christ, when many of them were deported to Babylon. During this exile, the Jews were in direct contact with the Aramaic-speaking peoples, which facilitated the assimilation of this language. Although Hebrew remained the language of sacred texts and religious practices, Aramaic became the common language among Jews, especially in everyday life and administrative matters. As linguist Eugene Nida, one of the foremost scholars in the field of biblical translation, notes, Aramaic was consolidated in Palestine due to intensive contacts with the peoples of the Babylonian Empire. Now, when the Jews returned to their land in 538 before Christ, after their liberation by the Persian Empire, they brought with them Aramaic as their primary language of communication. Although Hebrew continued to be used in sacred texts and religious practices, Aramaic had become the common language of the people. This transition was so profound that by the 1st century at the time of Jesus, Aramaic was spoken by the vast majority of Jews. Aramaic remained a crucial language in Israel even during Roman rule. Despite the presence of other languages, such as Greek, which was used in administrative and commercial contexts, Aramaic remained in everyday use and in local interactions. During the following centuries, Aramaic continued to be spoken by Jewish communities and also in other parts of the Middle East. Aramaic was therefore a widely spoken language in the Middle East for centuries, especially in Mesopotamia and in some regions of Syria and Israel. However, the use of Aramaic began to decline after the spread of Islam and the rise of Arabic as the dominant language from the 7th century after Christ onwards. According to historian David Crystal, Aramaic was progressively replaced by Arabic as Islam spread throughout the region. The process of Arabization began with the Muslim conquest, but in many places Aramaic continued to be spoken in specific communities well into the 13th century. Now, how did the Greek language come to the region? To understand this, we must go back in time to the conquests of Alexander the Great, which marked a crucial turning point in the linguistic and cultural history of the entire Mediterranean world. When Alexander the Great set out on his series of conquests in the 4th century before Christ, he extended his empire from Greece to the regions of Egypt, Persia, and beyond. With him came not only military domination, but also a profound cultural influence. Greek was consolidated as the language of power, administration, and culture in all areas under Alexander's control, and later, in the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after his death. This expansion of Greek is known as Koine Greek, a simplified and standardized form of classical Greek that facilitated communication between people from different regions and origins. As Alexander's empire disintegrated, his successors, known as the Diadochi, continued to promote Greek as the primary language of administration and culture. In the case of Israel, Hellenistic influence was further consolidated with the arrival of the Romans in the 1st century before Christ. Although the Romans brought with them their own language, Latin, Greek continued to be the predominant language in many of the eastern regions of the empire. This phenomenon was due to the deep imprint left by Hellenistic culture, which was already firmly rooted in the urban, commercial, and educational life of the region. The influence of Greek was so significant that, even under Roman domination, the language remained the main means of communication between the various communities of the Mediterranean world. This therefore meant that Israel, although the majority of the population continued to speak Aramaic or Hebrew in their daily lives, Greek was used for administrative matters, commercial, and in many spheres of intellectual and religious life. Biblical texts, such as the writings of the New Testament, they were written in Koine Greek precisely because this language provided an effective way to reach a wider audience beyond the borders of Israel. In other words, Greek not only facilitated the transmission of the teachings of Jesus and his followers within Israel, but also played a crucial role in the expansion of Christianity to other parts of the Roman Empire and beyond. Thanks to this common language, the early Christians were able to communicate effectively with people from diverse cultures and regions, which greatly contributed to the rapid spread of Christianity in the Mediterranean world. Thus, the arrival of Greek in Israel and its subsequent consolidation as a language of global communication had a profound impact on the development of Christianity, allowing their messages to spread more effectively and reach a much wider audience than if they had limited themselves to local languages such as Aramaic or Hebrew. Now, after having examined and analyzed the predominant languages at the time of Jesus, we can now find the answer. What language did Jesus speak? There is no doubt that Aramaic was the everyday language of Jesus and of most Jews during the 1st century. According to scholar John Meyer, a renowned expert on the study of the historical Jesus, most of Jesus's teachings, as transmitted in the Gospels, were probably expressed in Aramaic. Although the Gospels were written in Greek, the common language in the intellectual and commercial sphere of the Roman Empire, several passages preserve Aramaic phrases, which shows that Jesus spoke this language regularly. Notorious examples of this phenomenon include expressions such as Talitha Kumi in Mark chapter 5, verse 41, meaning, "Little girl, get up," and Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani in Matthew chapter 27, verse 46, which translates as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Zrenia, both clearly in Aramaic. Bart Ehrman, a biblical scholar, states, "These phrases were not translated in their entirety in the original texts because they were an integral part of the message and experience of the early Christian community." End of quote. Aramaic was therefore a language deeply linked to Jesus' daily life. While Greek was adopted by the authors of the Gospels to reach a wider audience, Aramaic remains a key piece to understanding the linguistic and cultural context of Jesus' teachings. The preservation of these phrases in the Gospel texts demonstrates how Aramaic was not only the language of everyday life, but also the vehicle of the deepest and most significant moments of Jesus' life. Now, a question arises that troubles many. Did Jesus also speak Hebrew? To understand this question, it is important to consider the role of Hebrew in 1st century Israel, especially in relation to Aramaic and Greek, which were also commonly used languages in the region. Hebrew was, above all, the language of the Holy Scriptures. The Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, was written entirely in Hebrew, and for centuries this language was central to the religious and cultural life of the Jews. Although Aramaic had become established as the common language of the majority of Jews, especially in their daily interactions, Hebrew continued to be the language of sacred texts and religious rituals. The Hebrew spoken in the 1st century was not the ancient or biblical Hebrew of the times of the patriarchs, nor the classical Hebrew of the prophets. It was actually a later form of Hebrew, sometimes known as Second Temple Hebrew or post-biblical Hebrew. This type of Hebrew had experienced certain modifications, influences from languages such as Aramaic and Greek, and was used mainly in religious and liturgical contexts. Although it maintained the structural basis of biblical Hebrew, over time it acquired a different vocabulary and certain grammatical constructions. In other words, the Jews of Jesus' time did not speak the ancient Hebrew used by the authors of the Tanakh, but rather an evolving form of Hebrew that was still used in the synagogue and in sacred texts. Hebrew remained the language of the synagogue and the temple in Jerusalem, where it was used in rituals and prayers. As New Testament scholar Bruce Metzger describes, Hebrew remained indispensable for the reading of psalms, blessings, and recitation of the Torah in synagogue rituals. Rabbis used Hebrew to teach and comment on the scriptures in religious contexts. In the synagogue, Jews read and recited blessings, psalms, and the Torah in Hebrew, and interpretations of sacred texts were made in this language. The fact that Hebrew was so closely linked to religious life does not mean that it was a language exclusively for rituals. It was also fundamental for the transmission of religious teaching. Therefore, although Jesus probably spoke Aramaic in his daily life, as it was the common language in Israel at that time, he was also familiar with Hebrew, specifically with Second Temple Hebrew, which was used in the synagogue and in Bible studies. This fact is fundamental to understanding the linguistic context in which Jesus lived and taught. It is very likely that Jesus had knowledge of Hebrew, especially in relation to the scriptures, since, as a rabbi and teacher, it was common for him to receive training in the interpretation of sacred texts. In Jesus' time, rabbis were not only spiritual leaders but also interpreters of the law, and their education included in-depth learning of the Hebrew scriptures. As New Testament scholar Craig Keener notes, Jesus' rabbinical training would have enabled him to read and understand Hebrew texts, especially those that were essential to Jewish religious life. One of the clearest evidences that Jesus was familiar with Hebrew is the passage in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. which describes how Jesus reads the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue at Nazareth. Let us read the biblical text. He came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue, as was his custom, and stood up to read. And there was given unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. This act of reading the scriptures in the synagogue was most likely done in Hebrew, since that was the language in which the sacred texts were read in that context. This event reflects how Jesus, as a teacher and spiritual leader, not only mastered Aramaic as a language of everyday use, but also Hebrew, a fundamental language for the religious life of the Jewish people. Reading and interpreting the scriptures in Hebrew were essential activities for rabbis, and it is therefore reasonable to conclude that Jesus had a background that enabled him to understand and teach in this language. Now, did Jesus also speak Greek? The question of whether Jesus spoke Greek is a complex one. Greek was the dominant language in the Roman world, especially in urban areas and in interactions with authorities. In other parts of the Roman Empire, such as Rome itself, Greek was widely spoken among the educated classes and elites. As for Jesus, he was probably not a fluent speaker of Greek, since Aramaic was the main language of the region of Galilee where he lived, and Hebrew was used in religious contexts. However, some scholars suggest that Jesus may have had at least a basic knowledge of Greek, especially given the socio-political situation in Israel at the time. Cambridge University historian and linguist Richard Bauckham explains that Koine Greek was present in Israel as the language of Roman administration, trade, and interaction with non-Jews. Therefore, it is likely that Jesus had contact with Greek, although his primary language was Aramaic. Bauckham also points out that although there is no direct evidence that Jesus spoke Greek regularly, it is possible that in some situations, such as conversations with non-Jews or with Roman authorities, he may have used Greek. Theologian Nicholas Thomas Wright, in his influential work Jesus and the Victory of God, also suggests that Jesus probably had some knowledge of Greek because of the environment in which he lived. Wright points out that in regions under Roman rule, especially in areas with a presence of Romans and Greeks, Greek was a common language for administration and trade. However, Wright points out that although Jesus would have been exposed to Greek in certain contexts, Aramaic remained the primary language used by Jesus and his disciples in their daily lives and teachings. The Gospel of John chapter 18 verses 33 to 37 offers possible evidence that Jesus had contact with Greek, as it describes a dialogue between Jesus and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who probably did not speak Aramaic or Hebrew. Although the Gospel does not specify the language of this conversation, some scholars argue that, given the nature of the interaction and the culture of the time, it is quite possible that Jesus used Greek to communicate with Pilate. Scholar John Meyer, in his work A Marginal Jew, notes that it is likely that Jesus could understand and perhaps speak some Greek, since interactions with Roman authorities would have required some basic knowledge of the language. Furthermore, some research suggests that the use of Greek was not limited to elites or Roman authorities, but was present in various areas of daily life in Israeli cities such as Jerusalem and Tiberias, where Jewish communities coexisted with Greeks and Romans. This makes plausible the idea that Jesus, as a leader and teacher, may have had some exposure to Greek, especially in situations involving interaction with foreigners. Thus, although Aramaic was the primary language of Jesus and Hebrew had a central place in religious life, it is very likely that Jesus was at least familiar with Greek due to the cultural and political context in which he lived. Greek, therefore, was a language present in Jesus' environment, although it was not used as prominently as Aramaic in his daily life and teachings. The question of Jesus' language has significant implications, both historical and theological, especially when it relates to current practices within certain religious groups. First of all, some groups, such as certain Judaizing movements or within Messianic Christianity, they argue that believers should use Hebrew to recite the sacred names of God, such as YHWH or Elohim, and that speaking or learning Hebrew is essential for an authentic understanding of the faith. However, this view does not necessarily fit with Jesus' practice or teachings. The fact that Jesus did not teach in ancient Hebrew or require his followers to do so suggests that specific language is not a determining factor in following Christ. In second place, the danger of linguistic idolatry. Some theologians and scholars argue that using language as a barrier to faith can be problematic. If one claims that one must speak only Hebrew in order to be authentic or to fully understand God, one runs the risk of falling into what might be called linguistic idolatry. This would mean placing language on a pedestal, making it more important than the theological and spiritual principles that should be the focus of Christianity. Jesus never condemned the use of other languages and preached to everyone, regardless of their mastery of Hebrew or Aramaic. Now the question would be, is it correct that Jesus' followers should speak Hebrew? No, the emphasis on speaking Hebrew as a requirement for being a true follower of Jesus is not found in the biblical teachings or historical practice of Christianity. Jesus taught a message of salvation that was accessible to all people, regardless of the language they spoke. As theologian Wright explains, the gospel is not limited to a specific language or culture. According to Wright, Jesus' message was for everyone, not conditioned by language or the specific linguistic traditions of the Jews. While Hebrew and Aramaic were important in the historical and religious context of Jesus, it is not necessary for followers of Jesus to speak these languages to be considered authentic or to understand Christ's teaching. The Christian faith transcends language barriers, and the message of Jesus remains relevant to everyone, regardless of the language they speak. This reminds us that the heart of Christianity is not in a specific language, but in the personal relationship with God and the understanding of the message of salvation that Jesus conveyed. We also want to emphasize that we are not against carrying out a deeper and more enriching study of the Scriptures. It is essential to study the original words in the languages in which they were spoken, that is, in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. These languages give us a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the message and context of Scripture. The study of the original texts allows us to grasp the subtleties and meanings that are sometimes lost in translations, and thus, to delve deeper into the true meaning of biblical passages. Koine Greek, for example, has a wealth of meanings and grammatical structures that are not always fully reflected in translated versions. In this sense, the study of the original languages is not only an academic tool, but also a way of getting closer to the essence of Jesus' message. Through this knowledge, we can discover more about the intentions of the biblical author, the traditions of the time, and how the Christian message was transmitted and understood by its first listeners. And so, we come to the end of this video. We sincerely hope that the information shared has been useful and enriching for you, and that it has contributed something valuable to your understanding or interest in the subject matter discussed. We really appreciate your time and attention, and we would love to have you join us for the next video. See you soon. God bless you.